She was the woman tasked with pouring water, a trembling and invisible figure in the background. To them, she was a complete nobody. That was their first mistake. The evening that the undisputed king of Sicily, Don Salvatore Moretti, strode into Il Giglio, every bit of air was sucked from the grand dining room. Men who took lives without a second thought found themselves dabbing sweat from their brows, their expensive tailored suits feeling like cages. Yet when the timid waitress made her way to the head table, she did not fumble a glass or let her voice crack. She met the gaze of the world's most feared man and uttered 5 simple words in a dialect that had not been spoken outside the remote hills of Corleone since 1990. The room did not merely fall quiet, it became frozen in time. Because that was not a simple welcome, it was a pronouncement of death, and in that entire opulent space, only 3 individuals understood its true meaning. This is the story of Sophia, the unassuming waitress who concealed an entire kingdom under her simple uniform. This story will prove that in a world full of wolves, the most dangerous creature isn't the one with the sharpest fangs. It's the one who knows exactly when to strike. It will show you that being invisible is not weakness. It's the ultimate power. If you've ever been dismissed as nobody, underestimated, or overlooked, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. The dinner service at Il Giglio was not a meal. It was a carefully choreographed symphony of controlled desperation. Located deep in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, the restaurant stood as a monument to marble, rich mahogany, and the kind of wealth that spanned generations. It was a place where a single bottle of wine was worth more than Sophia's monthly rent, and the wealthy patrons whispered about corporate takeovers, hostile acquisitions, and other matters that would put normal people behind federal prison bars for decades. Sophia Rossi pulled her apron strings tighter, feeling them bite into the flesh at her waist. She glanced at her own image reflected in the gleaming brass of the massive espresso machine. She saw deep, dark circles beneath her eyes, a carelessly tied bun, and a uniform that hung loosely on her frame. She looked precisely like the person she was trying so hard to be, utterly forgettable. Rossi, table 4 is out of water. Get to it now. The floor manager, a perpetually sweating man named Mr. Henderson, who carried the permanent scent of burnt coffee and failure, snapped his fingers right in front of her face. "Yes, sir. On my way," Sophia murmured, deliberately keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. She glided through the bustling dining room like a phantom. That was her greatest skill. A long time ago, she had learned the harsh lesson that survival depended on being unnoticed. If no one saw you, no one could harm you. If you remained silent, you could never be made a target. For 3 long years, she had existed as a ghost within the sprawling chaos of New York City. She paid for her small sublet in Queens strictly with cash, took jobs that paid under the table, and made it a rule to never hold anyone's gaze for more than a fleeting moment. But this particular night, the very air in Il Giglio felt charged and heavy. It was different from the standard pressure of a busy Friday evening. This tension felt sharper, more menacing. The entire kitchen crew had been walking on eggshells since 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The head chef, a notoriously temperamental Frenchman who normally treated plates as projectiles, was instead quietly and meticulously polishing the stainless steel counters himself. "A big party is on its way in," Marco, a young busboy, whispered as he stacked a tray with dishes near Sophia's station. "The owner himself called," he added, "said to clear out the entire VIP mezzanine for them." A cold knot of apprehension formed at the base of Sophia's neck. "Who is it? A senator or something?" Marco just shook his head, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Much bigger. It's the Morettis." The water glass in Sophia's hand tilted sharply, slipping a full inch before her fingers tightened around it. A small splash of freezing water stung her wrist like a wasp. Moretti. In certain parts of the city, that name was treated like a vile curse. To the public, they were legitimate businessmen, consultants in waste management, or titans of the shipping industry. But in the shadowy corners of the city that Sophia so carefully avoided, the Moretes were the only law that mattered. Dante Morete was the modern face of the family, dangerously handsome, ruthlessly efficient, and impeccably corporate. But clearing the entire mezzanine suggested the old guard had come to town. "I need to take my break," Sophia said, her voice shaking almost uncontrollably. "No breaks for anyone," Henderson snarled from across the kitchen pass. "They are here. Everyone line up by the staircase. Now." Sophia's heart began to pound against her ribs like a frantic, caged animal. She was trapped. She knew that trying to run at this moment would only draw the very attention she had spent years avoiding. To be seen by these men was to be erased. She obediently took her place at the far end of the service line, her head bowed low, sending a silent prayer to a god she had long forgotten, begging to be allowed to stay invisible just a little longer. The massive front doors of the restaurant swung inward, and the ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. The security detail entered first, 4 imposing men who appeared as if they were sculpted from solid granite, their lifeless eyes methodically sweeping the room. Following them was Dante Morete. Sophia dared to peek through her lowered eyelashes. He was devastatingly handsome, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed molded to his powerful frame. He carried himself with the fluid, predatory grace of a jungle cat. His dark hair was combed back, and his jaw was set in a line of grim resolve. He had the look of a man who found violence tedious, but was an absolute master of it. But the room had not frozen for Dante. It held its collective breath for the man who followed him. Don Salvatore Morete, the capo di capi of the old world. He appeared to be in his late 60s, depending heavily on a polished ebony cane that was capped with an ornate silver lion's head. He wore a dark fedora and a heavy wool overcoat, making him look like a ghost from a bygone era. His face was a roadmap of faded scars and deep-set wrinkles, and his eyes remained concealed behind dark, tinted glasses. A profound silence fell over the entire restaurant. Forks paused in mid-air. Lively conversations evaporated into nothing. Mr. Henderson was practically quivering with a mixture of terror and excitement. "Welcome, Don Morete. Mr. Morete, this is a true honor." Dante simply raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "The table, now." "Of course. Right this way, please." As the powerful procession filed past the line of terrified staff, Sophia held her breath, repeating a silent mantra. "Do not look up. Do not look up. Do not look up." And then, Don Salvatore came to a complete stop. He was standing directly in front of her. The rich, heavy scent of expensive cigars and aged leather enveloped her. Sophia kept her eyes glued to the perfectly polished leather of his shoes. "This one," Salvatore said, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together. "She is trembling." Dante let out a quiet sigh, the sound filled with exhaustion. "Papa, please, let us just sit. The young woman is simply nervous." "Fear is a useful thing," Salvatore murmured softly. He reached out and tapped the toe of Sophia's worn shoe with his cane. "Look up at me, Bambina." Sophia forced her eyes shut for a brief second, desperately clinging to every detail of the character she had so carefully constructed for herself, the timid, terrified, invisible girl. She raised her head, making her eyes go wide and allowing her bottom lip to tremble ever so slightly. "I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, deliberately making her voice higher and more fragile than it naturally was. I have never been this close to a truly famous person before." Salvatore studied her for a long moment, his dark, sharp eyes piercing through her disguise. For one heart-stopping second, Sophia was certain he could see past the cheap uniform and the manufactured fear, all the way down to the very blood that coursed through her veins. And then he let out a laugh. It was a dry, rasping sound. "Famous, yes. Fetch our wine, little mouse, and be certain you do not drop it." They continued on. Sophia finally allowed herself to exhale. suddenly aware that her knees were physically knocking against each other. She had made it through their arrival, but she knew with cold certainty that the night's trials had only just started. Dante Moretti unfastened the button on his suit jacket as he took his seat, his eyes expertly sweeping the entire mezzanine level. The area was secure. He had his own men positioned at the top of the stairwell and at the kitchen entrance. Despite the precautions, he could not bring himself to relax. His father's presence in New York was a constant logistical and strategic nightmare. Salvatore simply refused to comprehend that the world operated differently now. He had no regard for RICO acts or the pervasive threat of surveillance cameras. He demanded old-world respect. He demanded fine wine, and he demanded the opportunity to criticize Dante's management of the American operations. "The design of this place has no soul," Salvatore grumbled, waving a dismissive hand toward the high, vaulted ceilings. "It feels like a bank." "You conduct business in a bank, Papa," Dante countered smoothly. "This is modern. It is what the people with money appreciate now," he replied, motioning for the sommelier. He didn't actually want the sommelier. He wanted a large glass of scotch, but tonight was for honoring tradition. "People appreciate what we instruct them to appreciate," Salvatore stated plainly. He glanced around the large table. His old consigliere, Rocco, and two of his most trusted Sicilian bodyguards were seated in stoic silence. "Where is the little mouse? I am thirsty for wine." Dante caught Henderson's eye and gestured, and the manager. He brutally forced the terrified waitress toward the grand staircase. Dante's eyes followed her reluctant advance. She was a small woman, with a pale complexion and wide, frightened brown eyes. She clutched the heavy bottle of Bordeaux as if it were an explosive device, ready to detonate. Dante thought to himself, "She looks like she might collapse at any moment." Wonderful. Just another complication to handle. Salvatore's voice cut through the tension, commanding her to open it. As Sophia finally arrived at the table, her hands were visibly trembling. But then, Dante witnessed something peculiar. The very instant the corkscrew made contact with the bottle, her shaking ceased completely. Her actions became deliberate and graceful. The tool was applied with flawless leverage. The sound of the cork leaving the bottle was little more than a soft sigh. She executed a perfect professional pour, not allowing a single drop to be wasted. "How curious," Dante mused. "She has nerves of iron once the task begins." She carefully set the wine glass down in front of Salvatore. The old Don gracefully swirled the deep red liquid, inhaled its aroma, and then peered up at her, a playful sparkle animating his eyes. He was putting her through a trial. He invariably tested the new staff. It was a cruel game of power he savored, a way to make the ordinary people feel uneasy. "Are you of Italian descent?" Salvatore inquired, speaking in English. "Yes, sir. My grandmother," she answered in a near whisper. "From what region?" he pressed. "Naples, sir." At this, Salvatore scoffed, dismissing her with a casual wave of his hand. "Naples," he said with contempt. "A city of loudmouths, thieves, and street performers." Dante noticed the waitress's jaw clench for just a moment. It was a tiny, fractional movement, a brief flash of something that was not fear. It almost looked like wounded pride. Salvatore leaned closer across the table, shifting his language to standard Italian. "Do you comprehend this language, or are you simply another American girl with a vowel attached to the end of her name?" Sophia dutifully lowered her head. "I understand a little bit, signore," she answered in a broken but passable Italian. Salvatore flashed a cruel smirk. He then turned his attention to Rocco, switching languages yet again. This time, it was neither English nor the Italian she had just spoken. He slipped into the coarse, heavy dialect of the Sicilian countryside, using a very specific local slang from the mountains surrounding Corleone. It was the language of shepherds and highwaymen, a tongue so obscure it was unintelligible even to the majority of mainland Italians. "Look at this one, Rocco," Salvatore said in the ancient dialect, a wide grin spreading across his face. She has a pretty face, but her eyes are vacant. She is like a sheep waiting patiently for the butcher's knife. We could bring her back to the villa with us. She would be good for warming a bed for a night or two before we are done with her. It was a vulgar and brutal examination of her character. Salvatore frequently made shocking statements in the dialect just to see if anyone in the vicinity would react. If they flinched, he knew they were secretly listening. If they showed no reaction, they were considered safe. Dante's body went rigid. He despised it when his father spoke in that crude manner. "Papa, that is enough," he warned sharply in English. But then the unexpected happened. Sophia had been backing away from the table, the silver tray held tightly against her chest. She should have continued walking away. She should have maintained her role as the invisible girl. But the insult, the specific and degrading phrase about being a sheep destined for slaughter, struck a deep, forgotten chord within her, bypassing years of carefully conditioned survival instincts. She stopped moving. She slowly turned back to face the most powerful table in the restaurant. The silence that fell was immediate and absolute. Dante stared at her, completely bewildered. Was she about to burst into tears? Sophia looked directly at Salvatore. The fear had vanished completely from her features. Her entire bearing changed, her spine straightened, and her chin rose with an authority that was, for one heart-stopping second, nothing short of regal. When she finally spoke, the voice that emerged was not the timid, high-pitched tone of the young waitress. It was a deep, guttural sound, a flawless and rhythmic cadence from another time. The sheep that lives to see the dawn is the one that watches the wolf as it sleeps, Don Salvatore. And a guest who dares to insult the bread of his host will eat only ashes in the morning. She uttered the words in the old dialect. It was more than just Sicilian. It was his family's specific tongue, the archaic, nearly forgotten phrasing from the very heart of the Moretti stronghold. It was a pattern of speech filled with words that had not been in common use since the 1970s. A sudden crash echoed through the silent room, shockingly loud. Rocco's fork had clattered from his hand onto the fine china plate. At the far end of the long table, two of the guards immediately moved their hands inside their suit jackets, their sharp gazes fixed directly on Sophia. But Dante remained perfectly still. He found he was unable to move. His eyes were locked on his father. For the very first time in his entire life, Dante witnessed Don Salvatore Moretti look utterly and completely stunned. The old man's jaw was slack, his mouth hanging slightly open. All the color had drained from his face, leaving it a pale, waxy gray. He was looking at Sophia not as a server, but as if he were staring at a specter from his past. "Who are you?" Salvatore managed to whisper, and his powerful voice was trembling. Just like that, the enchantment was shattered. Sophia's eyes grew wide as the immense gravity of her mistake crashed down upon her. The mask she had worn for years had not just slipped, it had fallen away completely. She had just revealed her true self before the most lethal and unforgiving family on the planet. I need to go get the antipasto," she stammered, the words coming out in a desperate gasp. She spun around and fled. This was not a quick walk. She sprinted with all her might toward the kitchen's swinging doors. "Get her!" Salvatore roared, his voice a thunderclap as he slammed his heavy cane down on the table, shattering a crystal wine glass into 1,000 pieces. "Bring her to me this instant!" Dante was already moving, rising from his chair. "Stay here," he commanded his men, his mind racing at incredible speed. He leaped effortlessly over the low brass railing of the mezzanine and immediately took off in pursuit of the waitress. He burst through the kitchen doors just in time to see the restaurant's back exit swinging shut. "Move!" Dante yelled, physically shoving a terrified sous chef out of his path. He kicked the service door open with explosive force and spilled out into the dark, rain-soaked alleyway behind the building. He scanned left, then right, his eyes piercing the gloom. At the far end of the narrow passage, he spotted her. She was moving incredibly fast. She was scaling a tall chain-link fence with an athletic grace that no simple waitress should ever possess. "Stop!" Dante shouted, his hand moving on pure instinct toward the holstered firearm, secured at the small of his back. She paused for a moment at the very top of the fence, glancing back at him over her shoulder. Beneath the sickly yellow glare of a lone street lamp, their eyes met across the distance. Dante had expected to see pure terror in her gaze. Instead, what he saw was cold, hard calculation. She was not running away like a frightened victim. She was executing a tactical retreat like a trained soldier. "You have no idea what you have just done," Dante called out, taking a cautious step forward into the rain. "I know exactly who you are, Dante Moretti," she called back, her voice ringing out, clear and unwavering. "And I know that if your father discovers who I truly am, he will not just end my life, he will burn this entire city to the ground to get to me." With that, she dropped down to the other side and was instantly swallowed by the night. Dante stood alone in the downpour, adrenaline coursing hot and fast through his veins. He raised a hand and touched his earpiece. "Boss," the voice of his head of security crackled in his ear. "Do you want us to lock down the entire restaurant?" "Forget the restaurant," Dante growled, his gaze fixed on the empty fence. "Find the girl. I want you to find out everything about her. And under no circumstances are you to let my father get his hands on her first." Sophia did not stop running until her lungs felt as if she had swallowed fire. She moved in a frantic, zigzagging pattern through the confusing maze of Tribeca's streets, doubling back on her path through dark alleys, cutting through a busy subway station without ever boarding a train, and finally emerging a full 6 blocks from where she started. She slipped quietly into a 24-hour laundromat, collapsing onto a hard plastic chair in the rearmost corner, effectively concealed by a long row of churning, vibrating dryers. She pressed her forehead down hard against her knees, desperately trying to will the violent shaking in her limbs to stop. Stupid, 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 stupid. 3 entire years of hiding. 3 years of painstakingly dyeing her hair this dull, mousy brown color. Of choosing clothes that would deliberately hide her natural shape. Of actively suppressing the fierce fire that coursed through her blood. And she had thrown it all into ruin over a simple insult. But it was not just an insult, she knew. It was hearing that specific dialect. It had triggered something deep inside her, a powerful muscle memory, a visceral, gut-level reaction from a childhood that she had fought so hard to bury deep in her past. Her phone began to buzz in her pocket. It was a burner. A cheap, prepaid flip phone she kept only for the most dire emergencies. Just one person in the world had this number. She flipped it open. It was a single text message. "They are looking. Leave the apartment now." Sophia stared at the glowing screen for a long moment. Then, with a surge of resolve, she crushed the device in her hand, broke the tiny SIM card in two, and discarded the shattered pieces into a nearby trash can. She could never go back to Queens. Her apartment was no longer safe, it was compromised. Her emergency stash of cash was hidden beneath the floorboards there, along with the forged passport that identified her as a woman named Maria Fiore. Now she was Sophia Rossi once again. Or more accurately, she was now the person she was always born to be. She quickly checked her pockets. $50 in tips, the key to her locker, and a small pocket knife she never went anywhere without. "Okay," she whispered to the humming and sloshing washing machines. "Think. What would Papa have done?" The mere thought of her father brought a fresh, stabbing wave of pain. Do not think about the blood. Just think about the lesson. Lesson number 4. When the wolf is on your trail, you do not run to your den. You run toward the water. She rose to her feet, wiped the tear tracks from her face, and walked with newfound purpose out of the laundromat. She had to get to the docks in Red Hook. An old associate of her father's was there, a man who owed her family a sacred debt that even death had not managed to cancel. Meanwhile, back at Il Giulio, The atmosphere was as grim and silent as a funeral. The entire restaurant had been cleared of every patron. The terrified staff were now being held in the main kitchen, all of their phones confiscated. Dante paced restlessly in the private dining room, his eyes fixed on his father. Don Salvatore was just sitting in a chair, his gaze locked on a blank wall. He looked a full decade older than he had just an hour before. He was drinking grappa from a small glass and his hand was trembling slightly. "Papa," Dante said, deliberately keeping his voice quiet and low. "The boys are already scrubbing all the closed-circuit television footage. We managed to get a trace on her employee file. The social security number was fake, and so was the address. She is a complete ghost." Salvatore did not even look up. She spoke the Arboresh of the inner circle, Dante. It was not just the dialect. It was the code. "I heard her," Dante confirmed, pouring himself a drink as well. "She made a threat against you. She said you would eat ash." "No," Salvatore corrected him, his voice suddenly sharp. "That was not a threat. It was a proverb. A guest who insults the bread of his host. It is something the wives of the capos used to say to the arrogant young men when they became too full of themselves. It is a phrase of correction, a statement of authority." Salvatore finally looked at his son, and his eyes were haunted. Only one family ever used that exact phrasing, the Valentis. Dante froze completely. The glass he was raising stopped halfway to his lips. "The Valentis are all dead. You killed them yourself. Every last one. The night of the long knives, back in 1998. You wiped their entire bloodline from existence." "I thought I did," Salvatore whispered, his voice hoarse. "Giovanni Valenti had a daughter. Her name was Sofia. She was only 12 years old when their house burned to the ground. We found a body. The teeth were a perfect match for her dental records." "Dental records can be faked if you possess enough money and influence," Dante said, his mind racing to process the terrifying implications. The Valentis were the only family that had ever posed a true challenge to the Morettis for the throne of Sicily. They were ancient, they were ruthless, but they were also honorable in a way that the modern mob simply was not. "If that young woman is truly Sofia Valente," Salvatore said, his voice hardening from a whisper into pure steel, "then she is the rightful heir to a blood vendetta that demands my head on a platter. And she has been serving me water for how long, exactly?" "6 months," Dante answered. He felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. He had walked right past her almost every single day. He had ignored her completely. And during all that time, she could have put poison in his food, stabbed him in his sleep, or burned the entire establishment to the ground. Why had she not done it? "Find her, Dante," Salvatore commanded, pushing himself to his feet and leaning heavily on his cane. The momentary frailty was completely gone. The lion was back. "Find her before the Russos discover that she even exists. If our many enemies learn that a Valente is still alive, they will rally to her banner. It will ignite a full-blown civil war." "I will bring her to you," Dante promised without hesitation. "Alive," Salvatore added, his voice cold. "I want to look directly into her eyes when I finally finish what I started 20 years ago." Dante gave a curt nod and turned to leave the room, but as he stepped out into the cool, damp night air, he made a silent decision. He would find Sofia Valente, of that there was no doubt. But he was no longer certain that he was going to deliver her to his father. Because for the very first time in his privileged life, Dante Moretti was utterly intrigued. And for a man who already had everything he could ever want, a true mystery was the only prize worth chasing. The rain in New York City never washes things clean. It just makes all the existing grime on the streets slicker. By the time Sophia finally reached Red Hook, the relentless storm had transformed the city into a blurred, abstract watercolor of smeared neon and oppressive gray. The docks were a veritable graveyard of rusted-out shipping containers and towering cranes that looked like the fossilized skeletons of long-dead prehistoric beasts. She limped unevenly toward a dilapidated bait and tackle shop at the very edge of Pier 41. To any casual observer, it looked completely abandoned. The windows were boarded over with weathered plywood that had started to rot around the rusting nails. But Sophia knew better. She knew that 3 feet below the waterline there was a sophisticated pressure sensor. If you failed to knock on the front door in the precise rhythm, 2 quick taps, a slow one, then 3 more quick taps, a shotgun rigged just behind the frame would turn your chest into bloody pulp. She raised her fist and knocked. Rat-a-tat, thud, rat-a-tat-tat. A long, tense silence followed her signal. Then came the metallic screech of a heavy, rusty deadbolt being pulled back. The door cracked open an inch, revealing a sliver of absolute darkness and the menacing barrel of a Remington 870 shotgun. "We are closed," a voice rasped from within. It sounded like heavy chains being dragged across a concrete floor. "The tide is high, Enzo," Sophia called out, her own voice remarkably steady despite the uncontrollable shivering of her body. "But the fish are not biting today." The shotgun barrel lowered instantly, the door swung fully open. Enzo the butcher stood there, filling the doorway. He was 70 years old, wearing a grease-stained tank top that showed off arms completely covered in old, faded ink. He had been her father's most loyal lieutenant, the very man who had smuggled her out of Sicily, wrapped tightly in an oriental rug on a fishing trawler the horrific night her entire family was murdered. "Sophia," Enzo breathed, his eyes stretching wide with disbelief and fear. He yanked her into the bait shop and threw the heavy door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He quickly engaged 3 separate heavy-duty locks. "My God, I thought you were safely tucked away in Queens. I believed you were out of reach." Sophia could only respond, "I was." Her body felt like a lead weight as she leaned against a tall stack of wooden lobster traps, her legs giving out until she slid all the way to the dusty floor. "I was safe, right up until tonight. I saw him, Enzo. I saw Salvatore." The name hung in the air, and all the color drained from Enzo's face. He rushed to her side, pressing a worn, ragged towel into one of her hands and a bottle of cheap, harsh brandy into the other. "You saw him? Did he recognize you?" "He saw a simple waitress," Sophia said, her voice raspy. She took a long, burning swallow of the liquor that seared its way down her throat. "But then he insulted our family, using the old dialect. I could not stop myself, Enzo. I responded to him." Enzo squeezed his eyes shut and let out a quiet, bitter curse in Italian. "You answered the devil in his own tongue," he murmured, his voice filled with dread. "Now the entire pack will be on the hunt for you." "I need the package, Enzo," she declared, her gaze locking onto his with newfound intensity. "The one Papa left for me." Enzo wavered, his face a mask of conflict. He looked down at the young woman he had fiercely protected from the lurking shadows for the last 20 years of her life. "That is a suicide mission, Sophia. If you open that box, there is no possibility of going back. You can never be just a waitress again. You will become the Dawn once more. You will become their primary target." "I am already their target," she countered, pushing herself up from the floor. The profound exhaustion that had clung to her moments before seemed to vanish, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp anger that straightened her spine. "Give it to me, Enzo," she commanded. He let out a long, defeated sigh, broken by the chilling resolve in her eyes. It was the exact same fearsome look her father, the legendary Giovanni Valente, used to get just before he would order a man to be eliminated. He turned and walked behind the cluttered fish counter, using a crowbar to pry up a loose floorboard that no one else would have noticed. From the dark, hidden space beneath, he carefully lifted out a heavy steel briefcase wrapped meticulously in oil-treated cloth. He set it on the countertop with a heavy thud. Sophia reached out, her fingers slowly tracing the cold, unforgiving lines of the metal. She knew what was inside. It held the codes to all the Valente family's offshore bank accounts, the complete contact list of the sleeper agents her father had strategically placed across Europe, and most critically, it held the Libro Rosso, the Red Book. This single volume contained documented proof of every bribe paid, every murder ordered, and every single betrayal committed by the other five powerful families over the past 30 years. It was not just leverage, it was a weapon of mass destruction. Take it, Enzo said, his voice heavy. There is a boat waiting at the very end of the pier. The key to the Lucia is hidden under the welcome mat. Get to Jersey. I will do my best to hold them off if they show up here. They will not come looking for you, Enzo, she said, her voice softening with affection. They have no idea that you are still alive. A loud crash from above cut her off. The skylight directly over them exploded inward, sending a shower of glass raining down like lethal, sparkling diamonds. Thick ropes snaked down from the exposed ceiling beams. Before Enzo could even lift his shotgun, a flashbang grenade landed and detonated right in the center of the room. The entire world dissolved into a blinding sheet of white light. A piercing, high-frequency whine screamed inside Sophia's ears, disorienting her completely. The force of the blast hurled her backward into the stack of lobster traps, knocking the air from her lungs in a painful rush. As the thick smoke swirled and the ringing in her head continued, she could see dark, menacing figures rappelling down the ropes. They were covered in tactical gear, their faces obscured by night vision goggles, their weapons fitted with suppressors. This was not a police raid, and these were not the Moretti family's common street thugs. This was a team of highly trained professionals, executing a mission with military-grade precision. Enzo let out a furious roar, firing his shotgun blindly into the disorienting smoke. A loud boom echoed, and one of the shadows crumpled to the ground. But in the next instant, three distinct red laser dots converged on the center of Enzo's chest. No, Sophia shrieked, desperately scrambling for the briefcase. The suppressed rifles fired with three quiet pops. Thip, thip, thip! Enzo's body jerked violently backward as three small, dark holes blossomed across his shirt. He slumped forward over the counter, gone from the world before his body even finished falling onto the wood. Sophia had no time to grieve. Pure, raw instinct surged through her. She snatched the handle of the steel briefcase and threw her body to the right. A fraction of a second later, a spray of bullets tore through the floorboards right where she had been. She scrambled on her hands and knees behind a heavy, industrial-sized freezer, her mind screaming one thought: the back door. She had to get to the back door. Using all her strength, she kicked the heavy freezer door open, using it as a temporary shield, and bolted for the rear exit. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the metal doorframe as she ran through it. She burst out onto the slick, rotting wood of the pier. The drizzle had turned into a torrential downpour, and a savage wind howled around her. She sprinted toward the Lucia, a small fishing boat that was bucking and plunging violently in the choppy waves. "Nowhere left to run, princess!" a voice yelled, cutting through the storm's roar. Sophia's feet slid on the wet planks as she skidded to an abrupt halt. Standing directly between her and her escape was Dante Moretti. He was completely alone. He held a handgun loosely at his side, the barrel pointed safely at the ground. He wore no tactical gear, just a soaking wet, ruined designer suit, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. "You led them right to me," Sophia spat, her voice thick with hatred as she clutched the precious briefcase to her chest. She backed away slowly toward the treacherous edge of the pier. "I did not lead anyone," Dante shouted back, taking a careful step forward into the wind and rain. "I came here by myself. Just look at them, Sophia. Those are not my men." Sophia risked a quick glance back toward the bait shop. The entire tactical team was now pouring out of the back door. They were raising their weapons, their aim directed not just at her, but at Dante as well. "Drop the weapon, Moretti," the lead commando's voice boomed over the storm, "or we have explicit orders to clean the whole slate." Dante's face showed a flicker of pure confusion, his mind struggling to process the scene. "What?" "It is a coup, you absolute idiot!" Sophia screamed at him. "Get down!" But she did not run. She did not dive into the churning water below. Instead, she reached deep into her apron pocket. She was somehow still wearing the ridiculous waitress apron. Her fingers closed around the flashbang grenade she had managed to scoop up from the floor of the bait shop right after the first soldier had fallen. With practiced efficiency, she pulled the pin and lobbed the device in a high arc over Dante's head, sending it sailing directly toward the assembled tactical team. The grenade went off with a deafening bang. Dante recoiled, instinctively shielding his eyes from the blinding flash. When he dared to look up again, the professional soldiers were completely disorganized, stumbling around, temporarily blinded and disoriented. "Move now!" Sophia screamed. She grabbed Dante by the lapel of his incredibly expensive suit and began dragging him forcefully toward the edge of the pier. "What in the world are you doing?" Dante yelled, struggling against her grip. "I am saving your life, so I have the pleasure of killing you myself later." With those words, she shoved him with all her might. Dante flailed, toppling backward off the pier and hitting the freezing, oily water of the Hudson River with a huge splash. Clutching the briefcase tightly, Sophia jumped in right after him. A hail of bullets ripped into the water's surface just above them, the projectiles leaving trails of bubbles that looked like swarms of angry hornets. But in a moment, the dark churning current of the Hudson swallowed them both, pulling them down into its murky depths. The underside of Pier 41 was a dark, tangled forest of rotting wooden pilings covered in sharp barnacles. The air was thick with a toxic mixture of raw sewage and gasoline. Dante Moretti broke the surface, gasping for air, finding himself in the suffocating gloom beneath the pier. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 icy needles. He thrashed wildly in the dark, his hands searching for something to hold on to, finally finding a slippery crossbeam. "Be quiet," a voice hissed out of the complete darkness. He froze instantly. Sophia was clinging to a nearby piling, only 3 feet away from him. The steel briefcase was now securely strapped to her wrist with her own belt. She was shivering violently, her thin waitress uniform plastered to her skin, but her eyes were sharp and focused on the narrow gaps in the floorboards directly above them. The heavy thud of combat boots stomped overhead. Bright beams from powerful flashlights cut through the cracks, slicing into the darkness below like sharp blades. "Clear!" a voice echoed from above them. "They went under. The current probably already took them out." "Deploy the thermal drone." "Thermal," Dante whispered, a fresh wave of panic rising in his chest. "We have to move right now." "Shut up," Sophia snapped, her voice low and sharp. "Follow me. Stay as low as you can. If you make a splash, I will leave you here to die." She pushed off from the piling, moving through the water with a silent, efficient frog-like stroke, heading deeper into the labyrinthine darkness of the underpier. Dante followed, his well-trained muscles already starting to seize up from the intense cold. He was a boxer, a shooter, a man who spent 2 hours every single day in the gym, yet he was struggling to keep pace with the slender young woman who had been serving him wine just 2 hours earlier. She guided him to a rusted, algae-encrusted maintenance ladder. They climbed up into a storm drain tunnel that ran beneath the West Side Highway. The air inside was relatively dry, carrying the smell of damp earth and rats. They both collapsed onto a concrete ledge, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling. Dante rolled onto his back, staring up at the curved, dark ceiling. "Those men," he said between breaths. They were wearing Russian gear, but they spoke English with perfect American accents. "Mercenaries," Sophia stated, wringing the filthy river water from her hair. She quickly checked the briefcase. Its seal was still intact. "They are high-end private contractors." "Who hired them?" Dante demanded, pushing himself into a sitting position. "My father?" Sophia let out a harsh, bitter laugh that held no humor. "Your father wants the satisfaction of killing me himself. He would never send a faceless hit squad to blow up a little bait shop. He is old school. He would want to look me in the eye when it happened." She turned to face him directly, the dim light from a street grate above casting long, dancing shadows across her determined face. "And besides, they tried to kill you too, Dante. You saw the lasers. If I had not thrown that flashbang, your brains would be painting the docks right now. Dante fell silent. He could not argue because she was absolutely right. The order had been to clean the slate. Someone is trying to start a war, Dante said slowly, the gears in his mind finally turning and clicking into place. If I die, and the last Valente dies with me, who stands to benefit the most? Chaos always benefits the hungry, Sophia replied, quoting one of the old proverbs. She shivered, wrapping her arms tightly around herself to fight the cold. The Russos are far too stupid to plan something with this level of precision. The Costellos are too broke to afford it. It has to be someone on the inside, Dante realized, the thought rising in his throat and tasting like bile. Someone who knew exactly where I was going tonight. Only 3 people knew I was tracking you to Red Hook. Your father, Sophia listed off. No, Dante insisted. He would never kill me. Never. Your head of security, Thorne. Dante shook his head again. Thorne took a bullet for me last year. The man is loyal. Loyalty has an expiration date when the paycheck is big enough, Sophia countered coldly. Who else knew? Dante hesitated, the name feeling like a betrayal on his own lips. Rocco, the consigliere. Sophia's eyes narrowed into slits. Rocco, the same man who sat at your dinner table tonight, the one who laughed when your father called me a harmless sheep. He has been with my family since before I was even born, Dante said, his tone defensive. Which means he remembers the old days, Sophia shot back, her voice sharp with insight. He remembers when the Morettis were undisputed kings, not corporate chief executive officers like you. Maybe he thinks you have gone soft, Dante. Maybe he thinks your father has gotten too old to lead. Maybe he wants the crown for himself, she finished. Dante shot to his feet, pacing back and forth in the cramped tunnel like a caged animal. I need a phone. I have to call this in. You call anyone, and you die, Sophia said with unnerving calmness. They can track your voice print. They can triangulate your signal in seconds. If Rocco is truly behind this, you have to assume he has access to that National Security Agency level technology your family purchased last year. Dante stopped pacing and just looked at her. He really looked at her for the first time, seeing her in the dim, grimy light with dirt streaked on her face and a stolen steel briefcase resting in her lap. She was not the shy, timid waitress from the restaurant. She was a general planning a campaign. You seem to know a whole lot about our private operations for a girl who just busses tables, Dante said, a clear note of admiration creeping into his voice, in his voice. For 3 years I have watched you, Sophia said, her tone level and cold. I know the restaurants you frequent, the people who share your bed, and every secret place you stash your money. That was the Valente family method, Dante. We were more than just muscle. We gathered knowledge, because knowledge is the one weapon that never runs out of ammunition. Dante processed this chilling revelation. So why didn't you kill us? He asked, his voice low. You poured wine for my father. It would have been simple to slip cyanide into his glass. You could have easily stabbed me with a steak knife during dinner. Why all this waiting? Sophia glanced down at the briefcase, and for just a heartbeat, her expression softened, showing the shadow of the 12-year-old girl who had lost her entire world. Because death is far too simple a punishment, she whispered, the words heavy with old pain. Your father murdered my mother. He took the lives of my brothers. He set fire to my home. If I just ended his life with a bullet, he would die remembered as a legend, the great Don Salvatore. She lifted her head, and her eyes were burning with a cold fire. I refuse to let him die a legend. I need him to die a failure. I want him to witness his entire empire turn to ash, piece by painful piece. I want him to know, in his final moments, that it was a Valente who took everything from him, not with a gun, but with the undeniable truth. She gently patted the black briefcase. This case contains that truth, Dante. We call it the Libro Rosso. Inside is all the proof of the collaboration between the 5 families and the corrupt senators, the judges on their payroll, and the union leaders they control. If I decide to release this information, the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not just come for you. They will dismantle the whole corrupt system you inhabit. The Moretti name will be reduced to nothing but dust. Dante could only stare at the briefcase in disbelief. That book is just a story, a myth. My father told me it burned down with your house. My father managed to throw it out of a window to Enzo just before the roof gave way, Sophia corrected him. Dante dragged a hand through his thick hair. He was completely cornered. He was standing in a filthy sewer with a woman who possessed the power to unmake his entire world. And somewhere in the city above, a traitor was actively hunting both of them. So, Dante finally said, his voice barely a whisper. What is the plan now? You release the contents of that book, I end up in prison, and you finally have your revenge. I cannot release it yet, Sophia admitted with a hint of frustration. The data is encrypted. The key to unlock it is incredibly complex. And if I come out of hiding to try and decrypt it, Rocco's death squad will find me. Now that they are aware you survived, they will be hunting for you too. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her injured left leg. We are facing a serious problem, Dante. We are supposed to be mortal enemies. By every law of our world, I should kill you right here and take my chances alone, and you should be trying to choke me to death to get that book. But, Dante interjected, taking a deliberate step closer to her, if we do that, Rocco gets everything he wants. He seizes the throne, he buries my father, and then he will hunt us down individually until we are both dead. That is exactly right. Dante held out his hand. The gesture was an act of pure desperation, a Moretti offering a handshake to a Valente. It was an action that defied 100 years of violent, bloody history between their families. I am proposing a truce, Dante said plainly. Until we can survive this night, until we can confirm if Rocco is truly the one behind this, I will help you get to a secure location. In exchange, you do not release the book. Sophia stared at his outstretched hand. She saw the old scars across his knuckles. She met his gaze. His eyes were surprisingly gentle for a man who had been raised by a complete monster. She did not take his hand. I do not shake hands with Morettis, she said, her voice like ice. However, I will not kill you tonight. You should lead the way, boss. You obviously know this city much better than I do. Dante let his hand fall to his side, a small, weary smirk touching the corner of his lips. You are a terrifying woman. Has anyone ever told you that? I am just the waitress, she replied with a flat, emotionless tone. Of course, and I am just a consultant in waste management. Dante gestured down the dark tunnel. There is an exit point near Chelsea. I have a safe house there, one that is completely off the books. Not even my own father knows that it exists. It is an artist's loft. I keep it for my private time. You mean for your mistresses? Sophia asked, limping ahead of him. I mean it for my painting, Dante corrected her, his tone sharp. Sophia stopped and looked back over her shoulder, a flicker of genuine surprise on her face. You paint? Everybody needs to have a hobby, Dante grumbled, pushing past her. Let's go, before the rats down here get any braver. They navigated the oppressive darkness together, the two surviving heirs of a shattered kingdom, walking toward a new day that promised them nothing but more bloodshed. As they moved, however, their dynamic began to change. They were no longer the hunter and the hunted. They had become partners. And in the criminal underworld, a partnership, forged from sheer necessity, is frequently more powerful than a marriage created from love. But neither of them saw the tiny, blinking red light on the briefcase's handle. It was not a bomb. It was a sophisticated tracker. Far away, in a luxurious penthouse with a view of Central Park, Rocco smiled as he watched the small dot move steadily beneath 10th Avenue. I have you, Rocco whispered to himself, swirling the expensive cognac in his glass. First, kill the father. Then, kill the son. And make sure you bring me the girl. That Valente witch is carrying something that belongs to me. The safe house was not at all what Sophia had imagined. She was expecting a concrete bunker, a room without windows, with rifles mounted on the walls, and simple mattresses laid out on the floor. Instead, Dante guided her into a massive, high-ceilinged loft in the heart of Chelsea. The air smelled of turpentine and linseed oil, not of gunpowder and steel. The walls were adorned with huge canvases, each one filled with chaotic, yet beautiful paintings. There were violent explosions of red and black paint, silent screaming faces, and hands desperately reaching for help that was never going to arrive. "So you really do paint," Sophia whispered, her voice filled with awe as she dropped the heavy briefcase onto a spotless white sofa. She walked over to a large canvas resting on an easel. It was an unfinished piece, a portrait of a woman with profoundly sad eyes. "It helps to keep the ghosts quiet," Dante explained as he locked the heavy steel door behind them, activating a keypad deadbolt. He moved to a small kitchenette and retrieved a first aid kit. "Sit down. Let me take a look at that leg." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then sat on the edge of the pristine sofa. The rush of adrenaline was gone, and in its place was a deep, throbbing ache in her calf where she had scraped it on the pier. Dante knelt down in front of her. He carefully cut away the torn fabric of her waitress uniform, using a pair of medical shears. His hands, which she knew could be so dangerous, were now incredibly gentle. "It is just a shallow wound," he said, his voice soft as he dabbed antiseptic on her skin. "You will not be needing any stitches." "You have very good hands," Sophia murmured, her eyes fixed on him. "For a Moretti, anyway." Dante stopped what he was doing and looked up at her. Their faces were only inches from each other. The tension in the large room suddenly shifted. It was no longer the desperate tension of survival. This was something else, something magnetic and powerful. "And you have far too many secrets," Dante replied softly. "For a Valente." He finished applying the bandage to her leg, but he did not move away. "Why did you save my life, Sophia? The real reason. You could have just let those mercenaries kill me. That would have been one less Moretti for you to worry about." Sophia's gaze shifted to the painting of the sad woman again. "Because I was watching you tonight, in the restaurant right after your father insulted me. I saw you flinch. You despised it. You are not him, Dante." "I am exactly him," Dante said with bitterness, getting up and walking to the window to carefully peer through the blinds. "I manage his businesses. I clean up all of his messes. I am the designated heir to his throne." "You are a prisoner," Sophia corrected him from the sofa. "Exactly like I was. We are both just children who are forced to clean up our father's blood." Dante turned from the window to look at her, an expression of raw vulnerability crossing his face. For that one moment, the powerful Mafia prince vanished completely. He walked back toward her, pulled by a force that he could not begin to understand. He reached out his hand, his fingers gently grazing her cheek. Sophia did not pull back. Instead, she leaned into his touch, and her eyes slowly closed. "If we manage to get out of this alive," Dante whispered, "I am finished. I am leaving this life for good. I will take whatever money I have, and I will disappear." "There is no leaving," Sophia said with a deep sadness in her voice. "Not as long as Rocco is hunting us. Not as long as that book still exists." She looked down at the briefcase on the sofa. A sudden cold realization washed over her face. "Dante," she said, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. The handle on the case, it's warm." Dante's eyes went wide with alarm. He lunged for this briefcase and flipped it over. Embedded in the matte black steel close to the hinge was a tiny pulsing red light, no larger than the head of a pin. "A tracker," Dante hissed. "High frequency. How long has it been active?" Sophia was already on her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her leg. Dante glanced at his watch. "If he started tracking us from Red Hook, he is not coming here by himself. He is bringing his entire army." Crash. The skylight above them shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was happening just like when Enzo had died. History was viciously repeating itself. Ropes dropped down from the ceiling. But this time, Dante was prepared. He grabbed Sophia and threw them both behind a massive oak drafting table just as the room began to fill with tear gas. Masks are under the sink, Dante yelled, firing his handgun blindly over the top of the table. The main door to the loft exploded inward with a deafening boom. Through the swirling smoke, several figures began to emerge. But these were not just ordinary mercenaries this time. The man leading them, wearing a gas mask that made him look like some kind of mechanized insect, was Rocco. And he was dragging someone with him. Dante squinted his eyes through the stinging gas. Don Salvatore Moretti was thrown onto the floor in the middle of the room. He was not tied up, but he was completely disoriented, coughing violently from the gas. Rocco tore his own mask from his face, smiling like a predator as the loft's powerful ventilation system quickly began to suck the gas out of the room. "Come on out, Dante," Rocco shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Come out and introduce your new girlfriend to your father properly." Dante looked over at Sophia. "He is using him as a human shield." "No," Sophia said, her mind working furiously. "He is creating a stage. He wants Salvatore to see us together. He wants to frame you for all of this." "We have to finish this now," Dante said, his voice grim. He checked the magazine of his gun. "I have 6 rounds left. I count at least 10 men." "I have the book," Sophia said with determination. "And I know the decryption code." She started to stand up. "Sophia, do not do it!" Dante grabbed for her arm, but she was already moving. She walked out from behind the safety of the table, her hands raised in surrender, the heavy steel briefcase held in her left hand. "Hold your fire!" Rocco screamed to his men. A wide grin spread across his face. "Well, look at this! The waitress has returned!" Don Salvatore pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. He looked frail and utterly confused. He looked up and his eyes landed on Sophia. Then he saw Dante emerge from behind her, his own gun raised. "Dante," Salvatore rasped, his voice weak. "You are with her? You are with the Valente girl?" "He told you that I kidnapped her, did he not, Don Salvatore?" Sophia asked, her voice steady and calm, his voice echoing in the cavernous loft. She advanced until she stood a mere 10 feet away from Rocco. Salvatore, his anger returning, spat out the words. "He informed me that my own son was a traitor, that he was giving our family's secrets to the Valentes. He told me Dante planned to murder me and seize control." "And you took his word for it?" Dante shouted, his weapon still aimed directly at Rocco's forehead. "Father, just look at him. He was the one who hired the Russian mercenaries. He was the one who attempted to have me killed down at the pier." "All of it is falsehoods," Rocco stated with chilling calm. He pushed the barrel of his own gun firmly against Salvatore's temple. "Lower your weapon, Dante, or the old lion goes to sleep for good tonight." The entire room went still. It was an impossible stalemate. Dante knew he could not fire at Rocco without endangering his father's life. Rocco effectively controlled the situation. "Is it the book you are after, Rocco?" Sophia suddenly asked, holding up the briefcase. "This is the prize you are looking for, isn't it?" "Hand it over to me," Rocco ordered her. "Do that, and I might consider letting the boy survive. As for the old man, well, his time has already run out." "You do not want the book for the influence it gives you over the senators," Sophia declared, her voice growing stronger. "You want it because of what is written on page 42. Rocco's eyes betrayed him with a tiny, involuntary flicker, a fleeting expression of pure panic. "What information is on page 42? Salvatore demanded, his gaze shifting between them. "It is the detailed list of your skimming operations from 1995 to 2005, Sophia announced, fabricating the detail. She had no idea of the exact page number, but she was certain about the crime. She had studied Enzo's detailed notes. "He was not just your loyal servant, Don Salvatore. He was systematically robbing you. He took 10% from every single shipment. He constructed his own criminal empire using the scraps from your table." She is fabricating everything, Rocco yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Eliminate them! Eliminate them both now! Stop! Sophia yelled. I will open it. I will show you the proof. She carefully placed the case on the floor. She kneeled before it. She began to turn the combination dials. 12, 25, 98. It was the date her family home was burned to the ground. Her father had a dark sense of humor. Click. The metal latches sprang open. Rocco took a step forward, his greed overriding his sense of caution. He shoved Salvatore away and pointed his firearm directly at Sophia. Show it to me. Sophia lifted the lid of the case. Inside, there was nothing. Rocco just stared into the empty space. Where is it? What have you done with the book? Sophia looked up at him, a chilling and victorious smile spreading across her face. I destroyed it in a fire 3 years ago, Rocco. The real leverage was never in the book. She slowly tapped her temple. It has always been in here. Rocco's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. You... He lifted his pistol to end her life. A loud bang echoed. The shot did not come from Dante's gun. Rocco's body went rigid. An expression of complete astonishment appeared on his face. He glanced down. A crimson flower was blooming on the front of his shirt. He pivoted around slowly. Don Salvatore Moretti stood there, holding a small .22 caliber pistol that he had retrieved from a holster on his ankle. It was the one location Rocco had neglected to search. You stole from my accounts, Rocco, Salvatore whispered, his voice shaking with uncontrollable fury. You betrayed and stole from your own family. Rocco tried to speak, but only gargled blood as he collapsed onto his knees. I created you. You are less than nothing, Salvatore declared. He fired the weapon a second time. Bang! Rocco's body struck the floor. The mercenaries, witnessing the death of their employer, exchanged uncertain glances. They were paid professionals. If there was no paycheck, there was no reason to fight. Go, Dante commanded, gesturing with his weapon toward the exit. Get out of here before I contact the New York Police Department. The mercenaries showed no hesitation. They quickly scrambled through the shattered doorway and disappeared into the darkness of the night. A profound silence descended upon the loft, a quiet that felt heavier than anything before it. Don Salvatore stood over Rocco's lifeless form, his breathing labored. The small gun fell from his hand as he leaned heavily against a support pillar. Dante holstered his own weapon and quickly moved to his father's side, catching him just before he could collapse to the ground. Papa, Dante said urgently, feeling for the old man's pulse. Are you all right? I am just old, Salvatore grumbled, weakly pushing Dante's hands away from him. I am not dead yet. He straightened his jacket and then looked over at Sophia. She was still on her knees next to the open, empty briefcase. Salvatore used his cane, which Rocco had tossed to the floor, to tap against the metal case. You were not telling the truth, he said, his voice a low rasp, about the contents of the book. I was bluffing, Sophia calmly corrected him as she rose to her feet. A Valente always knows how to play a hand of poker. Salvatore observed her intently. For a long and excruciating minute, the only audible sound was the wind howling through the shattered skylight above. He examined her face, truly seeing her for the first time, and he recognized the spirit of Giovanni Valente. You have the same eyes as your father, Salvatore stated softly, and you have his relentless determination. And you now have a debt to repay, Sophia replied, her voice unwavering. I protected your son. I protected your entire empire from a traitor, and I chose to spare your life down in the sewer when I easily could have left you there to perish. Salvatore gave a slow, deliberate nod. That is the undeniable truth. The omerta is perfectly clear. A life must be repaid with a life. He reached inside his coat pocket and withdrew a large, heavy gold ring. It was the Moretti signet. He looked first at Dante, and then his gaze settled on Sophia. I am weary, Dante, Salvatore admitted with a sigh. Tonight has shown me that I cannot place my trust in the men I have raised. Except for you. He turned his attention back to Sofia. The feud between our families concludes tonight. The Valente family is gone. You are now Sofia. Rossi, your occupation is a waitress. Is that understood? Sofia paused for a moment. She looked over at Dante and could see the profound hope reflected in his eyes. Yes, she answered quietly. I am just a waitress. Excellent, Salvatore said. My son requires a good woman in his life, not another soldier. However, if I ever hear you speak in that specific dialect in a public place again, he warned, narrowing his eyes. The corner of his mouth twitched upwards into a slight smile. I will have to terminate your employment. Dante let out a laugh. It was a sound of absolute and total relief. He wrapped his arm around Sophia's waist and pulled her affectionately toward him. Let us get you back to the house, Papa, Dante suggested. The grand reopening of Il Gioiello was the most talked-about event of the entire season. The press corps was present, their cameras flashing, as they took photographs of politicians and famous celebrities. Yet the true center of power was located at Table 1 on the mezzanine level. Dante Moretti was seated at the head of that table. He was not dressed in a business suit. He wore a tuxedo, but his tie was fashionably loose. He appeared at ease and more content than ever before. Don Salvatore was seated to his right, appearing somewhat frail but genuinely happy as he sipped his Barolo. The quality of the service here has certainly improved, Salvatore remarked, his eyes scanning the busy floor. That is because I have a new manager, Dante replied with a broad grin. Sofia then approached their table. She was not dressed in a waitress's uniform. She was wearing a breathtaking backless red gown that was worth more than the old car she once drove. She was not holding a service tray. She moved with the confident grace of a queen. Gentlemen, she began, placing a gentle hand on Dante's shoulder, is everything to your satisfaction? It is perfect, my love, Dante replied, bringing her hand to his lips for a kiss. Salvatore looked directly at her. The wine is excellent, but I find the bread to be cold. Sofia did not even blink. She leaned in close, right beside the old Don's ear, and whispered in a flawless, heavy Sicilian dialect, You will eat the bread that you are given, old wolf, or I will have the cook put you on a restricted diet. Salvatore became completely still. Then he tilted his head back and began to laugh. It was a loud, booming laugh that was so powerful it caused the entire restaurant to turn and stare. She is absolutely terrifying, Salvatore said to his son, wiping a joyful tear from the corner of his eye. You must keep her. Sofia simply smiled, gave Dante's hand a gentle squeeze, and then moved away to welcome some of the other distinguished guests. She was no longer an invisible presence. She was now Sofia Moretti, the remarkable woman who had successfully tamed the lions. And as she glided through the room, not a single person dared to look away from her. And that is the story of how a shy waitress who once trembled while serving a simple glass of water rose to become the undisputed queen of New York. She did not use a firearm to win her war. She used her family heritage, her sharp intelligence, and the one weapon the Mafia was completely unprepared for. She used the truth. Sofia's story demonstrates that in a world filled with wolves, the most formidable creature is not necessarily the one with the largest fangs. It is the one who possesses the wisdom to know precisely when to strike. Sofia's journey teaches us something powerful. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The person pouring your water, the server you never look at twice, the nobody standing in the corner. They see everything, they hear everything, and when their moment comes, they can change the entire game. This story also reminds us that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing to rise above the pain and build something extraordinary from the ashes. Sofia could have killed Don Salvatore when she had the chance. Instead, she chose to become the queen of his empire. For those of you who have ever been dismissed, looked down upon, or called nothing, remember, Sofia. Your invisibility is your armor, your silence is your strategy, and your moment of triumph is coming. Now I want to know what you believe. Did Sophia make the correct decision by rescuing the very man who had destroyed her own family? Or do you think she should have pursued her own form of justice? Share your thoughts with me in the comments section below. If you found this tale of betrayal, love, and Sicilian justice compelling, please crush that like button. Be sure to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have an incredible new thriller being released next week that you will not be able to believe. Thank you for joining us, and always remember to stay dangerous. This content was carefully researched, crafted, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Every story we share is designed to touch your heart and remind you of your own strength. Thank you for being part of our community.